Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first installment of WPI's webinar series, Pop Places. I'm Elizabeth Garayeb, Executive Director of WPI, and on behalf of my colleagues from the Wesselmann Catalog Raisonné Project, Hoffa Frobes Cross and Claire Henry, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Before I introduce you to today's speaker, I'd like to provide a bit of an overview of our Pop Places series. Over the coming 5 weeks, each Tuesday, we will be bringing you talks from art historians in the fields of pop art who will be sharing their scholarship on the artists and the places around New York City that were fundamental to defining this 20th century avant-garde movement. The idea for this program was inspired by the wealth of materials we found among the Tom Wesselmann papers that the WPI has now made available through its digital archive platform. These archives are not only relevant to our Wesselmann Catalog Raisonné project, but they also hold photographs, correspondence, and press clippings related to the artists, dealers, and other key figures involved in the art scene of post-war New York. We hope you'll take a moment to explore our holdings on our website, wpi.art. At the top of the screen on our landing page, there's a tab that says Archives, and you can click to see what we have. Now on to the main event. Today, we have the privilege of featuring a talk by Melissa Rachleff, clinical professor of the Visual Arts Administration program at NYU Steinhardt. Melissa was also the curator of an acclaimed exhibition at the Grey Art Gallery in 2017 entitled Inventing Downtown, Artist-Run Galleries in New York City, 1952 through 1965. And this afternoon, she will be presenting her talk, Pop Art's Roots, 3 Experimental Places, which centers on the work of Jean Follett. After Melissa concludes her presentation in about 35 to 40 minutes, my colleague Claire Henry, who's the researcher for the Wesselmann Catalog Raisonné project, will moderate a Q&A with the audience. We ask that you please write your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box, at the bottom of the screen. We anticipate today's program will conclude at around 2 p.m., and I'm sure you'll enjoy it. And now I'll turn the screen over to Melissa. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And I also want to thank Hoffa Frobes Cross, Claire Henry, Jancy Creaney, and everyone at the Wildenstein-Plattner Institute for inviting me to give a talk this afternoon and for wholeheartedly supporting the theme of pop art's roots. I'm so grateful for this invaluable opportunity to share my research, and I look forward to your thoughts and reactions following my presentation. So I will now get started. Just going to share the screen. And okay. There is no doubt that pop art radically expanded contemporary art. Before pop, the criteria upon which all new art was evaluated, or the consensus about serious art, what constituted the avant-garde, had to do with pictorial rules governing composition, forms, texture, and color. These rules, derived from art history, were codified and taught in art schools. But pop was different because in the way artists appropriated everyday media, they did not seem to follow those rules. Many of us are familiar with Clement Greenberg's objections to pop as novelty art, a position developed further in Michael Fried's defense of modernism in his essay, Art and Objecthood. Clearly, new cultural theories had to be produced in tandem with pop's rise, and once accepted, had the effect of discounting modernist cultural values. Postmodernism, in other words, provided this new framework. My interest in the aesthetic shift pop represented derives from a biography I'm writing about the artist Jean Follett. I initially encountered Follett's artwork in an exhibition about artist-run galleries I organized for the Grey Art Gallery. Follett's work stood out as different yet rooted in modernism. I wasn't alone in perceiving this. Follett inspired some of the artists who were part of pop, including George Siegel, Jim Dine, and Red Grooms. In fact, she would be included in the 1993 hand-painted pop exhibition at the Whitney Museum, an affirmation of Follett's formative influence. Follett came to broad attention in 1953 when there was cultural consensus about modern art. But by the end of the 1950s, fissures emerged and had the consequence of limiting careers for artists like Follett. My talk then will explore this shift in the New York art scene to better appreciate the intellectual as well as visual rupture pop engendered. As part of this, I will braid three histories. First, a cultural framework based on the ideas of Meyer Shapiro and Lionel Trilling. Shapiro and Trilling, prominent New York intellectuals and professors of art and literature respectively at Columbia University, each played a role in defining New York's art community during the post-war era. While Shapiro focused on modernism's alignment with the freedoms accorded to citizens in Western societies, Trilling pinpointed modernist sensibility as a shift from sincerity as a core cultural value to authenticity as its defining feature. Second, I will discuss the career and work of Jean Follett and argue that her use of found materials and iconographic imagery was expanded by artists breaking away from modernism, though such a break was not something she advocated. As part of that, and this is the third aspect, 3 galleries will be introduced. The Hansa Gallery, which was active between November 1952 and May of 1959. And then after it closed, several of the artists who were part of the Hansa joined together with artists who were not to start a space that would produce both performances and exhibitions, which they called the Reuben Gallery. Concurrent with the Reuben Gallery, Richard Bellamy, who lost his job as gallery director when the Hansa closed, received financial backing from taxi magnate Robert Scull and opened a 57th Street gallery, which he named Green. I will argue that these places, Hansa, Reuben, and Green galleries, were central to pop because they were test sites for questioning authenticity as a value structure. Meyer Shapiro's essays are notable for considering the entirety of creative production in its social context. His subjects ranged from the Renaissance to Cézanne to the Armory Show, and Shapiro gave the reader both the object and the world in which the object was produced. Shapiro's conception of American modern art is most fully treated in a 1957 essay, The Liberating Quality of the Avant-Garde Art, in which he argued the differences among artists were less significant than what the artworks had in common. They conveyed, quote, inner freedom. This meant it didn't matter what the artist produced, be it representational or abstract or some combination of the two. The freedom to express, the liberation to express, confirmed art's separation from state control, apart from patronage, and affirmed the artist's autonomy. The artists made what they wanted to make, and ideally, the gallery system worked in tandem to support them. This unprecedented freedom meant art embodied new qualities. In the essay's central passage, Shapiro claimed, quote, the artist came to believe that what was essential in art, given the diversity of themes or motifs, were two universal requirements: that every work of art has an individual order or coherence, a quality of unity and necessity in its structure, regardless of the kind of forms used. And second, that the forms and colors chosen have a decided expressive physiognomy, that they speak to us as a feeling charged whole. The modern artist, in other words, used form expressively. The artist's gesture, a focus of art during the 1940s and 50s, aligned with what Shapiro defined as a, quote, affirmation of the self. Art probed psychoanalytic themes, the self in a world of conflict, and the endurance of the handmaid in a society where nearly everything was mass-produced. Quote, the work of art is an ordered world of its own kind in which we are aware at every point of its becoming, Shapiro reflected. The condition Shapiro describes is what pop art collapsed. We can root around a bit more in the concept of feeling to dispel its cliche. In a series of lectures given at Harvard University in 1970, Lionel Trilling defined the modernist sensibility on an axis that shifts from sincerity to authenticity. In brief, sincerity is epitomized by an artwork directed towards a perceived public and as such, the work is pedagogical. And Trilling cites the novels of Jane Austen as one of his examples. Under sincerity, we expect to learn a lesson about moral behavior, about what we should value about the world, about human nature. Now, at the same time, sincerity was dominant. A cross current was gestating. This new attitude placed less value on the public and more on expression for its own sake, irrespective of public opinion. This is authenticity. Rousseau is Trilling's central focus on the origin of authenticity, but his analysis of Wordsworth's pastoral poem, Michael, published in 1800, situates its conceptual roots. The poem is about a sheep herder, Michael, who loses his son to the city. The despair that befalls Michael over that loss and the feelings Wordsworth's representation generates in the reader is a condition Trilling terms as, quote, being in grief, where, quote, there is no within and without. He and his grief are one. So this is not sincerity. The grief is profoundly felt, nor is there any pedagogy. There's nothing to learn from Michael's despair. Trilling tells us, and we are impelled to use some word which denotes the nature of this being and which accounts for the high value put upon it. The word we employ for this purpose is authenticity. And if you will indulge me a little bit more on Trilling's concept of authenticity to bring it into the 20th century, in addition to the emotional clarity embodied by authenticity, there is also an object, not a public, towards which the feelings are directed. Trilling wrote that the terms, quote, provenance is the museum, where persons expert in such matters test whether objects of art are what they appear to be or are claimed to be, and therefore worth the price that is asked for them, or if this has already been paid, worth the admiration they are being given. In other words, art is not deemed excellent on a moral basis. Art is admired due to the reactions it evokes and one's ability to trace the object to its maker. This is the professionalization of the art system, the decline of state patronage that we saw in Shapiro. One more point on authenticity I'd like us to absorb before turning to these places before pop. Art under authenticity is not about pleasure. Quote, its ground prepared by 2 centuries of aesthetic theory and artistic practice, which have been less and less willing to take account of the habitual preferences of the audience. Of course, pop got its name in great part because of the pleasure it generated with the public and some, but not all, the critics. Unlike pop, authenticity meant that the artist was no longer reliant on audience approval, society's approval. The artist's, quote, references to themselves only or to some transcendent power, or who has decreed their enterprise and alone is worthy to judge it. In other words, and in keeping with the avant-garde, quote, down goes the artist, down goes the audience, up comes the artist. But at the same time, society still wants something from the artist. Society probes the challenge the artist lays before it. Quote, the work of art is itself authentic by reason of its entire self-definition. It is understood to exist wholly by the laws of its own being, which include the right to embody painful, ignoble, or socially unacceptable subject matter. The artist's goal then is to, quote, be as self-defining as the art object they create. These concepts are the basis of Follett's work. She was born in 1917 in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is also where she died in 1990. For about 16 years, from 1946 until early 1962, when a fire in a neighboring building destroyed her studio, Follett lived in New York City and took part in the Hansa Gallery. When the Hansa closed in the spring of 1959, Follett briefly exhibited at the 2 successor spaces, the Reuben Gallery and the Greenberg Gallery. In November 1949, prior to the Hansa Gallery's formation, Follett was invited to write an artist statement for a publication Robert Motherwell and Ad Reinhardt were planning. It was to be a second volume of their Modern Artists in America project, but it was never published. Preserved in her papers, Follett conceived of art making as dialectical. Her method involved a commitment to working in black and white, where her subconscious or, quote, inner space mingles with, quote, the conscious mind, resulting in a greater unity, a whole, or a sum total of both the soul and mind, end quote. And the object produced expresses, quote, the emotional and mental makeup of the artist, end quote. In other words, for Follett, the object she makes and her being are united in a self-defining act. She rejected the idea of art as, quote, mere decoration, possessing, beauty in the traditional sense. Like the surrealists, Follett mined her unconscious, letting the materials generate the artwork, guiding the process with rules she internalized about composition and form. Follett maintained that her method would, quote, bring about a synthesis of both the unconscious and conscious mind, and thus perhaps save the avant-garde from extinction. The work Follett produced was consistently discussed by artists and critics in the terms she established. There is very little comparison by observers of her work to other artists. Follett achieved an art that was authentic and unique to herself. This had disadvantages, because while artists readily championed Follett's work as singular, compelling, critics and dealers remained unsure. If you can't compare, can you take it seriously? And we're looking here in the next couple of slides of images from Miles Forst's first solo exhibition at the Hansa Gallery. And I think you'll recognize Marisol, who's the subject of an upcoming talk in this series, and Hans Hofmann in the first Hansa space. Being gendered female did nothing to assuage these concerns. If anything, it worsened them. But artwork shown in the context of the artist-run gallery meant such critical pressures were in the background, not the foreground. This is because artist-run galleries of the 1950s had different objectives from their commercial counterparts. Most were in downtown Manhattan on East 10th Street between 3rd and 4th Avenue, although the Hansa was on 4th Avenue and 12th Street, but close enough. This had the effect of segregating artist galleries from the commercial galleries on 57th Street or Uptown. Artist galleries did not rely on earned revenue from sales, so what was shown or how much was charged for the artwork wasn't necessarily strategic. Income was generated from monthly dues paid by members, and the fee structure was based on overhead expenses. The point wasn't profit. The point was to have a public venue for your artwork, generate conversation, maybe debate. Showing in an artist-run gallery meant published art reviews, selection in prestigious exhibitions like the Carnegie International and the Whitney Annuals, and importantly, to pave the way, if you will, for representation in the commercial galleries. Artist-run galleries gave members autonomy and control over what would be shown and how it would be shown. In solo exhibitions especially, the artist decided the checklist without curatorial or dealer input. Gradually, as the 1950s ensued, exhibitions themselves came to be a subject, a different kind of opportunity. Most of the Hansa Gallery artists met at the Hans Hofmann School of Art in the late 1940s. The Hansa was a gallery that captivated the art community. And I think in this other slide, you see Frederick Kiesler, his wife Lillian Kiesler, speaking with the poet Frank O'Hara. And in the background is a Hansa artist, Jan Muller, and I believe this is Wolf Kahn. So it's this wonderful nexus of people at all different phases in their art. So it was, to quote George Siegel, a space that was sparkling of color and bohemianism, the seedbed of all avenues of the 60s and 70s, the color burst school of Paris. So that's his exuberant definition and memory of the Hansa. Miles Forst, whose opening we've been looking at, an artist who co-founded the Hansa and whose first solo show of his abstract canvases opened in March of 1953, said that the atmosphere among artists was culturally serious without the attendant concerns of managing a viable art business. He encapsulated the Hansa as an enclave of people who didn't expect very much, but they enjoyed what they were doing. There wasn't the idea that there was something to be gained financially. I remember putting up shows in the Hansa Gallery and putting up $6,000 and $8,000 prices on them. And I was like, why not? It just didn't make any difference. I also find it significant that many of the artists associated with pop art, Jim Dine, Alex Katz, Red Grooms, Klaus Oldenburg, Tom Wesselman, and others all mounted important exhibitions at artist-run galleries. The Hansa artists also represented an aesthetic range. Some, like Wolf Kahn, worked in a figurative style or figuration that was gestural, expressive, and borrowed from the School of Paris, particularly Bonnard and Soutine. The Hansa also had artists who were difficult to classify, like Follett. For example, Jan Müller was very important to the Hansa group because of his outspokenness about the use of literature as source material. Of this time, of that place, the title comes from a short story by Lionel Trilling, kind of nicely rhythmic with what my reading list. And for his polemics against the current of abstraction. His work was known for its sensuality, his adept use of color and subjects that derived from German sources. Müller's personal experiences as a boy escaping the Nazis with his father, particularly his memories of the bucolic fields of southern France, were also integrated into his work. Richard Stankiewicz, who shared a studio with Follett for several years, welded found objects into figurative sculptures that were often funny. Their humor appealed to the public. He was successful critically and was one of the few artists at the Hansa whose work regularly sold. Apart from what he showed at the Hansa, Stankiewicz was essential to the gallery's operation. He not only rewired each loft they occupied and installed the lighting system, the first space on East 12th Street and again in the second space on Central Park South. He also acted as chairman and treasurer until he resigned from the gallery in 1958. Now, Follett worked on both canvas and wood. Her paintings demonstrate how she strove to get away from the craft of painting, the priming, the stretchers, and the use of color. We see in this early series here, which is now almost entirely lost or destroyed, how Follett's paintings anticipate assemblage. Their surface is built up from squeezing paint mixed with plaster directly from the tube, perhaps caulking tubes plumbers use. We still haven't figured out exactly how she did it, because it's plaster, not paint. Onto the canvas where she draws with ropes of plaster mixed with paint. Follett also affixed paint-dripped strings onto the canvas to form parts of figures for texture or to give a sense of motion. So this here, we've recently recovered this painting in a private collection. These are strings dipped in paint and just kind of laid onto a canvas, and you can see maybe more clearly around here just that kind of the way in which she's really drawing, by squeezing paint and plaster through some kind of tube. Follett, the use of tubular lines gave an illustrative quality without succumbing to representational technique. In this series, Follett maintains a tension between two subjects, paint as material and paint depicting a figurative image that together convey emotion. This is called Mother and Child, and it does go this way because there's another image of her studio that we uncovered. I uncovered that that has it hanging in this direction. But this is the head of a baby. These are, eyes of the baby, a kind of neck. And this kind of represents the lap of a mother. If we turned it the other way, you can kind of imagine that. But I think this is the right direction. Anyway, the figure of the child gradually emerges and stares at the viewer, impassive, insistent. The viewer perceives the tactility of the paint and how it expresses the pathos of the figures. But these two aspects are not fully integrated. For this reason, her work appears both abstract and representational. Follett's early exhibitions, as seen in this photograph of her second solo show on this side, and then this was a group show where she included many of her charcoal drawings. This drawing's in the collection of the Walker Art Center now. And this is a wire sculpture by Stankiewicz. Follett's early exhibitions then inspired critics to write of her paintings as archetypal. The reviewers would engage Follett's dualities, abstract, figurative, claiming the objects were sad and playful, childlike yet compositionally masterful. Hansa member Alan Capro thought her compositions recalled medieval paintings of saints, in which she deliberately avoided realism in favor of the icon. The abstract figurative dichotomies Follett produced did not rest easy with all the critics. Authenticity's limitation appeared in a column written by the art historian Leo Steinberg for the April 1956 issue of Arts magazine. The article opened with a dilemma Steinberg identified, whereby contemporary art and art criticism had reached an impasse. Standing before a series of Franz Klein's then new black and white, large-scale calligraphic paintings on view at the Sydney Janis Gallery, he confessed to struggling. Quote, "I found myself wondering again exactly what a critic is supposed to do," he wrote, and concluded that there is nothing for it but to be unapologetically autobiographical. The critic is compelled to write about themselves, in other words. The artwork is inaccessible aesthetically and socially. The meaning resides within the artist. The viewer critic does not have access and could only, quote, accept the picture as a starting point for his own reflexes. When meaning is not suggestive of human conditions, that being in grief authenticity postulated by Trilling, the critic struggles. Steinberg contemplates various ways to overcome the dilemma, including generating prose poetry about art, quote, synthesizing artwork with personal enthusiasm, and the resulting prose is a new entity wherein the picture is raw material. This is a form of art making from art, and ultimately Steinberg finds it critically flawed. In a startling passage, Steinberg offers an analogy on the limits of formalist criticism. Quote, "I found myself staring blankly at a bottle of ketchup, and my companion asking what there was in it that held me so spellbound. I focused and, just for the exercise, began to describe the patterns on the bottleneck, the close interpenetration of red blobs with negative spaces, etc. It was exceedingly well done, and if it were not for my natural modesty, I would be printing it." Steinberg had arrived at a place where anything at all, including the half-used ketchup bottle on the table, could be treated to formal analysis. Steinberg's act of imagining would blossom a few years later in the Tom Wesselman kitchen scenes, where condiments, including ketchup, do take center stage as subject. Steinberg's point, though, was that modern art criticism could not exist as a formalist exercise alone. Art criticism was deeply entwined with the writer's own authenticity, their subjectivity. Quote, "The essential duty of the modern critic is," Steinberg concluded, "the frank articulation of his own response." The last part of Steinberg's article is devoted to Follett's third solo show at the Hansa, where he experienced some of the same challenges he found in Klein. Steinberg admired the works themselves, but at the same time wasn't convinced the objects were as profound as they appeared. Was it all a lucky accident? Was Follett truly in charge of her method and thereby capable of consistently generating art at the highest level? What she is showing is hard to define, Steinberg began, because the artwork crossed several disciplines, painting, collage, and sculpture. In a sense, they are salvage operations, since they make a fine use of reconsidered rubbish and debris, or essays in metamorphosis, but not like swords into plows or sow's ears into silk purses, for the transformations are disinterested. They suggest rather a blind transportation from one culture to another. Steinberg might have thought about this transportation in terms of how the objects are treated, how Follett uses the object to serve a narrative symbolic purpose, not allowing the materials to rest on the picture plane as objects in the Duchampian sense, but by having them as part of an illustrative scheme. Steinberg might also be objecting to the way in which Follett's crude figures are mining non-Western art without acknowledging the source. He was also struck by the materials due to their small scale, their fragility, beyond junk, even worse. Quote, "We pay people to take such stuff away." And she is truly drawn to the humblest items. Yet the mastery of Follett's compositions, her material selections, make the assemblages difficult for him to totally dismiss. Two pieces in the exhibition drew Steinberg's attention. The Spirit emerges from 'neath the gravestones, and Mother and Child. Steinberg provides a wonderful description of both, including a formal analysis of the Spirit, noting that the nighttime scene and the contrasting light of the burlap moon and the burlap ground, the Spirit's head, a window lock onto which hair from straw and twine is affixed, and bisecting the elongated torso, also made of twine, a delicate clavicle bone formed from a broken bracelet chain and from which arms dangle. Most of all, Steinberg gets the pelvis. It is, quote, ironic iron with 4 bolts in it and sports a projecting handle, daring anyone to criticize the elusive sexual reference. Steinberg continues, the resulting picture, even after prolonged looking, maintains a state of conjugated incongruities. Only extreme sophistication could have worked this out, yoked to extreme naivete. And about the Mother and Child painting on board, Steinberg makes the analogy with depictions of the Madonna, quote, where all this abject gutter fruit is disposed like a Madonna icon, and the 2 paint tube caps, which the child uses for eyes, are so deployed as to stare anybody out of countenance. So this is the child, obviously, and I'm not sure the whereabouts, if it still exists, this painting, but these are caps from her paint tubes. Picking up on Follett's dichotomy, Steinberg postulated, in her ludicrous unuse of our common gadgets, Jean Follett's works become manifestos, at once innocent and sly, of non-attachment to mechanical routine. There is the further paradox of real sadness achieved with a display of jokes. There is the polar contrast of the very dark and the light. And lastly, the supreme antimony, or use of metals, the outrageous modernity of the method and the classic balance, the almost academic probity of the design. Here he indicates an approval of sorts, but the essay ends with Steinberg's frank articulation of his own response. Jean Follett tasks herself with expression alone, but is it art? Really, I haven't the faintest idea. Nonetheless, inspired by Follett, Alan Capro shifted from painting and began a series of action collages in 1956, the same year as Steinberg's article. Capro focused on the viability of the avant-garde and thought found objects had a vitality of their own, cycling from creation to decay and back into creation. Some of the materials he used in his collages, lights, plastics, toy parts, he expanded into the actual space of the Hansa in March of 1958. And this is another shift, that the exhibition could be conceived as an interactive event with the Hansa as a stage. This environment is at the root of art produced for public participation, a social turn, in other words, separate from the artist-centric goal in authenticity. In addition to Capro, Follett's work also inspired Hansa member George Siegel. He too began as a painter and shifted into assemblage, as seen in this early construction, and then the 1961 environment sculpture that he produced. Siegel appreciated the humanism at the root of Follett's aesthetic, and in his life-size sculptural tableau, he isolated and dramatized ordinary experiences. So the Hansa was a gathering place to exchange ideas, and when it closed in May of 1958, it left a gap in the art system for an unconventional risk-taking venture. Two Hansa alumni became crucial for the last phase of the era before pop, Alan Capro and Richard Bellamy. In reflecting on the Reuben Gallery, curator and critic Lawrence Alloway pinpointed its spirit as anti-ceremonious, anti-formal, untidy, highly physical, but not highly permanent. And with this description, Alloway credited assemblage with forging pop. And we're looking at Oldenburg's installation of the street, which he had actually shown in Greenwich Village at Judson Church Gallery just a couple months before, but salvaged that installation and basically a kind of cleaned up version of the street installed at the Reuben, treating these elements as objects less as an environment. And Alan Capro's very well-known 18 Happenings in 6 parts here as the pieces being assembled. And actually that was the inaugural show. So you can see that the artists are really kind of thinking of spatially, experientially, how you're going to navigate this particular space. There's this kind of greater sculptural concern. Follett participated in one group show at the Reuben, though she wasn't central to the gallery's identity. A few of the artists took assemblage into new directions. And we're looking at the work of Robert Whitman here, who also worked with found materials in this sculpture from 1959, which was, I believe, part of the Reuben show, and an earlier work that was shown at the Hansa of a checkerboard collage made from cellophane tape. So the shift from the wall into physical space was best described by Robert Whitman, who explained his trajectory from object to performance. He said, "You've got your painting flat on a wall, you have your sculpture coming out of the room, and you have sculpture that moves. Why stop there? Why not have abstract theater, or theater without words, or theater of images?" The Reuben also launched the careers of several women artists, including Martha Adelheid. Her extension paintings broke away from the rectangle and formed quadrilaterals and scroll-like horizontals. Adelheid conceived the series spatially as part of the architecture. She said, "I started drawing a line across the wall, starting on standard canvas, but continued the line gesture with strips of sheet metal covered with canvas and supported by thin strips of wood." Like Follett, Adelheid used wire, metal, and sand, but she was not interested in the modernist project in which Follett was so invested. Adelheid saw it as limiting, and she characterized the art system as, quote, "full of rules, do's and don'ts, boundaries. I wanted to break those rules." Indeed, breaking boundaries was the Reuben's mission in today's parlance, and once met, there was no interest in perpetuating the gallery. Robert Whitman recalled, "The idea was that too many things get dragged on past their vitality." This was the exhibit that Follett, you see her name there, was included in, and there are very few, if any, images of that show. But I also thought that this wonderful Jim Dine announcement also gives you that sensibility that will later be part of pop. The Green Gallery was different from the Reuben. Foremost, the gallery was not in the control of artists. It was incorporated as a commercial business and financed by Robert Scull. When Bellamy learned that the second floor gallery space at 15 West 57th Street would be available in the fall of 1960, Skull agreed to rent it for their venture. One of the gallery's virtues was Bellamy's ability to see art on its own terms, as an artist would. In 1960, Bellamy asked Follett to join the Green Gallery, and in a letter to her mother, she describes the space, so large and white with rooms and rooms and all new and fresh looking right off of Fifth Avenue. It is breathtakingly beautiful. To give a sense of the artists involved during this early phase, Lucas Samaris's first solo show conveys that ample space, so different from the smaller lofts downtown. His exhibition included pastels, figurines, and works made from liquid aluminum and sculpt metal. Like Follett, Samaris was received on terms he established. "I'm trying to shift the minor arts into the major arts," Samaris wrote of his use of humble materials in 1963. For contrast, this installation photograph of Claes Oldenburg's 1962 exhibition shows how some artists conceived of their work in relation to the gallery's proportions. Patty Muha, Oldenburg's wife at the time, sewed large-scale soft sculptures depicting an ice cream cone, hamburger, and cake, which Oldenburg then painted in the gallery. Oldenburg's sculptures depicting food, clothing, and toys would build on the Green's reputation as a harbinger for pop art. Follett never had that solo show at the Green. She was included in the first couple of group shows, and Bellamy kept examples of Follett's artwork in his back room, office, and but after 1962, only 2 female artists exhibited at the Green. I will not linger on the Green Gallery because Sarah Bancroft and Susan Davidson will be covering it in greater depth in this series as a vital pop art venue. I will end my talk with the Green's beginning, as it leaves us at a complex juncture where authenticity was still a cultural sensibility, but as we saw with Capro, Siegel, and Oldenburg, it was on the wane. Marc de Souverault inaugurated the Green Gallery in October 1960 with an exhibition that included 3 large-scale sculptures, and he maintained a lifelong relationship with Bellamy even after he quit the gallery in 1963 due to his discomfort with the gallery's patronage. De Souverault extended Follett's belief in individuality and pursuit of a vision irreducible only to the artist. In December 1960, artist critic Sidney Geist wrote a review that aligned with the Shapiro Trilling framework. Geist asked, "How do we recognize when an artist has achieved greatness?" Unlike Steinberg, Geist found de Souverault's abstract sculptures affirming to the critic's project. He invoked Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher also cited by Trilling in his discussion on authenticity. And kind of Nietzsche via Geist, Nietzsche wrote, "Artists know only too well that only when they do nothing willfully and everything of necessity does their feeling of freedom, subtlety, full powers of creative placing, disposing, and forming reach its height. That necessity, the freedom of the will, are one and the same when they create. Thus, the act of creating is the bringing into being of the ineffable. But for the materials to become art, there must be a corollary in knowing the compositional ability of the artist. The material and the emotional are in balance. The artwork is a singular individual accomplishment that can evoke a feeling of freedom in both the maker and the attuned perceiver. It is, in other words, authentic." Now, Donald Judd also reviewed this show, proclaiming the sculptures thunderous because of their scale and force, but he was more restrained than Geist overall. And his review emphasized the complex geometries created by each sculpture, a complexity he questioned. Judd's doubt echoed Steinberg's and formed the basis for a more sustained critique of de Souverault's sculpture in specific objects. Today, a watershed essay because it outlines new criteria for evaluating art, wholeness, into which pop fit, not compositional parts. In 1990, the art critic David Bourdon told interviewers Billy Klüver and Julie Martin, quote, "In the late 50s, I was so interested in what was called Neo-Dada and junk art. Pop art was a little afterthought. It was all this scrap stuff that was supposed to be the big movement. So I was so amazed when pop came along and demolished everything else. Or did it? One of the reasons I have enjoyed exploring the history of art organizations is that you're thrust into a complex system that is part aesthetics, part social, and part cultural. It opens new avenues of seeing, complicating assumptions, and requiring frameworks that come from literature which might not be in fashion. But it so wonderfully synthesizes the values of an era. In other words, cultural values of the past are not always obvious in what the artists made, but they emerge when you examine what they made and where the work was shown. Places like the Hansa, the Reuben, and the Green are significant for the projects that were produced in them, nearly all overseen by artists, and for retrieving a more complicated understanding of the past. Examining place is necessary too when histories are in danger of disappearing. Shapiro's acute sense of context and commitment to an object's autonomy, Trilling's theories of the modern artist as self-focused, authentic, disinterested, if not hostile to the public, are central cultural values. But the use of actual space and advertising imagery broke with those values. And as we saw in Steinberg's 1956 dilemma evaluating modern art, an endpoint was sensed. And his article cast doubt on authenticity as something a critic could or even should discern. The artists categorized as pop are also complex, but unlike Follett, whose work was mainly admired by other artists, pop found a public and was pleasurable. Pop art mined images not considered forms of self-expression, though of course, for nearly all the pop artists they were. The public was persuaded by pop art due to its recognizability, its transition away from debris, remake, not reuse. For the most part, the public didn't care what the critics had to say about pop. The art conveyed the meaning directly. The critics weren't necessary as intermediaries. Pop art forged new avenues of possibility relatable to the many, which had the effect of leaving out artists like Follett, whose project was always to speak to the few. Thank you.
Melissa, thank you so much for that amazing talk. Can everyone hear me and see me? All right, I'm just going to keep going. You've given us a lot to think about, so we're really pleased that you started our series off really beautifully. I'm going to start by asking you a few questions of my own, and then we'll open up the discussion to questions from the audience. Just everyone, please remember to put your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat so that we can surface them properly. One of my questions actually, Melissa, was how Follett's work influenced a raft of other artists in the 1950s, especially. And you've answered that beautifully. So we don't really, unless you have anything to add to drill down on it. I think what's really interesting for the WPI's perspective is that we also have some Jim Dine drawings from the period that Tom Wasselman kept, since they were colleagues and friends in our archive, and folks can access those through our website, through the archive portal on our website. I want to go back a little bit to, if you don't mind, Follett's relationship with Alan Cabral. You've written that her work was influenced by prevailing currents of modern art, namely Picasso and Surrealism. And you noted just now that she didn't advocate a break with modernism. But Cabral, who was Follett's really good friend and champion, saw her work through a more conceptual lens, perhaps. And he writes in Assemblage, Environments and Happenings in 1966 that the found materials in these artists' works that he's discussing in the book are the subject matter as well as the media, and that they refer directly to specific aspects of our lives. So maybe can you speak to the disconnect between how Cabral maybe saw Follett's art, his friend's art, and how she operated?
Well, you know, the materials are, I mean, I didn't do a big material analysis, but he's not wrong about that. When it comes to her, the materials really are from her life. In many instances, like I didn't put in the image, but she will sometimes put her torn nylon stockings, so that sometimes becomes a material. She'll her mother sewed, had a sewing machine in St. Paul, and that broke, and when her mother wrote a letter complaining that the sewing machine broke and that she's gonna have to save up and buy a new one, Follett immediately said, save that because I want to take it apart and use those parts for my work. And we see that she's using the materials from her paint. You know, she didn't throw away her paint caps. You know, those find their way into her work. And also she loved going on Hudson Street. At the time, Hudson Street was a place where there were a lot of like small scrap metal parts, radio parts, like it was like near Radio Row too, where you could, she said that there would just be bins of stuff, like no one knew what it was. And it's just like, so they would like, you know, charge you by the pound. And so she would go through those bins and just find things that she liked to kind of create a collection that she would then use. So I would say that he's right about that, that there's a connection. And he himself, Capro himself, was very connected to the materials that he was using. They either had a connection to his childhood or there was always some kind of reference that he was making. They weren't, you know, they weren't just anonymous.
And a lot of people downtown were working in this vein too, picking things up off the street, like Shari Deans and Rauschenberg. So it was very much in the air. I'm so curious, and I know we don't have time to discuss it, just about the actual objects like she would pick up and incorporate into her work. The question from audience member Vivian: although you showed installation photos, you only discussed one black and white work. Does her work exist? Have you actually seen it? Where can examples of her art be found?
Okay, so the Museum of Modern Art has an assemblage. I know I didn't show, I didn't do the standard. I wanted to bring in the social history, so I'm sorry that I didn't focus enough on her work. The Museum of Modern Art has, it's probably not on view, but they have one of her creatures. She would do, I focused on the women she was doing, but she also would do creatures. So they have, just slipping on the name, but they have an artwork that they actually purchased in 1960 because it was part of their Art of the Assemblage exhibition. And the Whitney Museum has Lady with the Open Door Stomach. And the Walker Art Center has one of her drawings. The List Center at MIT has another creature assemblage. So much of the time her work is very well taken care of in these museums, but much of the time they're not on view. However, in Texas, if you want to go to Austin, Texas and find yourself on the UT campus, you could see one of her later works on view. And that is at the Denton Art Museum. And the curator there put it on view, and she so kindly sent me pictures.
Oh, wow. That's great. A question from Huffa here from my colleague Huffa Frobes Cross. You've talked about how Follett's commitment to modernism made her distinct from pop, even while her interest in assemblage and appropriation prefigured pop. Are there later artists or groups that you see as picking up from Follett's particular approach?
Well, that's kind of where I threw in de Suvero, and also I would say Samaras. There's you know, this use of the kind of humble materials to do something complex and grand. So I would say that those are two artists who are her contemporaries, whose work I think, you know, continue to engage. You know, in that way. You know, there's definitely more, but those are the two right off the top of my head.
You spoke
And
a little bit.
Stankiewicz, of course.
What's that? Sorry.
Oh, Stankiewicz, of course. You
Oh
know,
yes, of course.
You know, the two of them.
How long did they shared a studio? How long was the relationship?
So that they 1951 until you know, really until 1955. And then they're kind of in the same building, but in different studios, and then around the corner from each other.
Okay, wow. Were their studios close to 10th Street galleries?
Yeah, on Bond Street,
Mhm.
and then on Broadway.
Okay, so very close by.
Like right around.
Yeah. I just want to give everyone a heads up that we're going to close here in a second, so please get your last questions in. You talked a little bit about that Follett gained some critical acclaim in the 50s and early 60s with both MoMA and the Whitney acquiring her works when they were fairly newly made. But interest in her work seemed to drop off. And understanding that she endured the studio fire in 62, and I think I've read a lot of her work was destroyed, and that she was forced to relocate as a result back home to St. Paul. Can we speculate a little bit more, or is it even right to speculate given the historical distance, about why her work didn't continue to gain popularity? She was championed by Cat Brown, but Dick Bellamy talks about how he kept her work, like you mentioned, at the Green. But was it merely the ascendancy of pop and happenings, or could it have been a gender-based bias?
Well, that's one of the things, it's very complicated. So there's not going to be like one answer. So there's also her personality and where she was willing to show, like some of her, her own, her own management of her own career, that comes into it. But then there's also at the Green, and I'm sure you'll learn more about it. Richard Bellamy wasn't in total control. There was the collector Robert Scull, who was amassing a major pop art collection. He was not interested in a major Jean Follett collection, and so that also foreclosed opportunities for her, but also for Miles Forst, for a lot of other artists that Bellamy thought were, really significant artists. So I think that in part is why is that the taste of some of the people who had control of venues, got marshaled in this direction, and also pop sold, museums and like very few collectors bought art that was made out of junk, so people did buy Stankiewicz's work, but I think that a woman doing that kind of work, it was more difficult. Even someone like Shari Deans, fortunately most of her work was preserved. But it was mostly preserved because it didn't sell, at the time. So, and I still think women artists have more of an uphill battle to this day, and how their work is valued monetarily is, a different, is still less than men. It's still a social bias in our society.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for participating in our Pop Places panel.
Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Just a reminder that next week we have our next speaker, who is Sarah Bancroft. She's the executive director of the James Rosenquist Foundation, and her talk on Rosenquist is titled "Pop Art Goes Viral: From New York City to Europe, Rosenquist's F-111 Takes Flight." So we hope you all will tune in next week, Tuesday the 27th, to hear from Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you, everyone.